Welcome back to another journey through the corridors of time, where tonight we embark on an epic exploration spanning over 1,000 years of German imperial history. Close your eyes and let me transport you to a world of emperors and warriors, of towering cathedrals and thundering battlefields, of enlightenment and darkness, of empire building and empire falling. The story of the German empires is not just one story, but three interconnected sagas that shaped the very fabric of European civilization and left an indelible mark on world history. Imagine standing in the great hall of Aachen Cathedral on Christmas Day in the year 800, witnessing Charlemagne crowned as Holy Roman Emperor, the first seeds of German imperial power being planted. Fast forward through centuries of medieval splendor, through the Reformation that tore Christendom apart, through the devastating 30 Years' War that left Germany a shattered landscape. Then watch as Prussia rises from the ashes, as iron and blood forge a new German empire in 1871, and as Kaiser Wilhelm's ambitions plunge the world into catastrophic war. Finally, witness the darkest chapter, as the Third Reich rises and falls in a maelstrom of horror that changed humanity forever. Tonight, you'll walk alongside Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa, stand with Otto von Bismarck as he reshapes Europe, and understand how a defeated nation transformed into history's most cautionary tale. So settle in, let your mind drift back through the centuries, and prepare to experience the complete, uninterrupted story of the German empires. Chapter 1. The birth of the First Reich. The winter wind howls through the marble corridors of Aachen as the year 800 draws to its close. Inside the palace chapel, a momentous event is unfolding that will echo through the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, kneels before Pope Leo III, and as the pontiff places a golden crown upon his head, a new empire is born. The congregation erupts in acclamation, proclaiming him Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. This Christmas Day coronation marks the beginning of what will become known as the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich, an institution that will endure for over a millennium. But to understand this moment, you must first understand the man. Charles the Great, as history remembers him, has spent decades forging an empire from the fractured remnants of Rome's western territories. His campaigns have been relentless and often brutal. The Saxon Wars alone consumed 30 years of warfare, forcing the pagan Germanic tribes to submit to both Frankish rule and Christian baptism. Thousands died refusing conversion, their bodies testimony to Charlemagne's unwavering conviction that his empire must be united not just politically, but spiritually. The empire Charlemagne rules on that fateful Christmas Day stretches from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to Rome itself. It encompasses modern France, Germany, the Low Countries, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. This vast domain represents the first serious attempt to reunite Western Europe since the fall of Rome 3 centuries earlier. Yet Charlemagne is more than a conqueror. He envisions himself as a new Roman emperor, a Christian Augustus who will bring order, learning, and faith to a continent still emerging from the chaos of the migration period. In Aachen, his chosen capital, Charlemagne establishes a court that becomes the intellectual heart of Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians will call it, sees the preservation and copying of classical texts, the standardization of script, and the foundation of schools throughout the empire. Scholars like Alcuin of York gather at court, debating theology and philosophy, advising the emperor on matters both sacred and secular. Charlemagne himself, though likely never fully literate, possesses an insatiable curiosity about learning and surrounds himself with the greatest minds of his age. The administrative machinery Charlemagne builds is impressive for its time. He divides his realm into counties, each governed by a count who serves as judge, military commander, and tax collector. Royal messengers, the missi dominici, travel in pairs throughout the empire, inspecting local administration and reporting back to the emperor. These traveling inspectors, one ecclesiastical and one lay, ensure that Charlemagne's justice reaches even the most remote corners of his domain. He issues capitularies, legal decrees that cover everything from military organization to agricultural practices, from church discipline to commercial regulations. But empires built on conquest and personality rarely survive their founders intact. When Charlemagne dies in 814, he leaves his realm to his sole surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Louis lacks his father's commanding presence and political acumen. Religious and sincere, he allows the church greater influence over imperial affairs and struggles to manage the competing ambitions of his own sons. The empire begins to fracture almost immediately. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally divides the Carolingian Empire among Louis's three surviving sons. Charles the Bald receives West Francia, the kernel of future France. Louis the German takes East Francia, the foundation of what will become Germany. Lothar, the eldest, receives the imperial title and a narrow strip of territory running from the North Sea to Italy, including Aachen itself. This middle kingdom, Lotharingia, becomes a contested borderland that France and Germany will fight over for the next 1,000 years. East Francia, the German portion, faces immediate challenges. Unlike West Francia with its relatively cohesive Romance-speaking population, East Francia is a patchwork of distinct Germanic tribes. Saxons in the north, Franks in the west, Bavarians in the south, and Swabians in the southwest. Each maintains its own dialect, customs, and sense of identity. The German kings must constantly balance regional powers, granting autonomy to powerful dukes while trying to maintain some semblance of central authority. The Carolingian line in East Francia expires in 911 with the death of Louis the Child. The German nobles, faced with the choice of accepting Carolingian rule from West Francia or electing one of their own, choose the latter. They select Conrad, Duke of Franconia, as king, establishing the principle of elective monarchy that will characterize German kingship for centuries. This election represents a crucial divergence from Western European practice, where hereditary succession becomes the norm. In Germany, the great dukes and bishops will maintain the right to choose their king, a tradition that ensures constant political maneuvering and prevents the emergence of a strong centralized monarchy like those developing in France and England. Conrad's reign proves tumultuous, as he struggles against the Magyar invasions devastating Central Europe and against rebellious dukes unwilling to submit to royal authority. On his deathbed in 918, Conrad makes a remarkable decision. Rather than trying to secure the succession for his own family, he recommends that the dukes elect his greatest rival, Henry of Saxony, recognizing that only a strong king can save Germany from the Magyar threat. Henry I, called the Fowler, becomes king in 919 and immediately sets about strengthening the realm. He builds fortified towns along the eastern frontier, creates a cavalry force to counter the Magyar horsemen, and negotiates a 9-year truce with the invaders, buying time to prepare defenses. He also begins expanding German power eastward, conquering Slavic territories beyond the Elbe River, initiating the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east that will characterize German expansion for centuries. When Henry dies in 936, his son Otto inherits a stronger, more unified kingdom. Otto I has ambitions beyond merely being king of Germany. He looks to the legacy of Charlemagne and dreams of reviving the imperial title, of once again uniting Central Europe under a German emperor. His opportunity comes from an unlikely source, the papacy itself, threatened by Italian nobles and desperate for a powerful protector. Otto marches into Italy, defeats the papal enemies, and on February 2, 962, Pope John XII crowns him emperor. The Holy Roman Empire is reborn, now firmly centered in Germany rather than Francia, and will remain a defining institution of European politics until 1806. Chapter 2. The medieval empire's golden age. Otto the Great's coronation in 962 establishes a pattern that will define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The German king must travel to Rome to receive the imperial crown from the Pope, linking the two institutions in an uncomfortable but seemingly necessary partnership. This relationship, forged in mutual need, will produce some of the most dramatic conflicts of the Middle Ages, as emperors and popes struggle for supremacy in Christendom. Otto understands that controlling the church means controlling Germany. He implements the Ottonian church system, appointing bishops and abbots who serve as both spiritual leaders and imperial administrators. These prince-bishops receive vast territories, castles, and secular powers, becoming the backbone of imperial government. Unlike hereditary nobles who can build independent dynasties, celibate bishops cannot pass their lands to heirs, ensuring their territories revert to imperial appointment upon their deaths. This system proves remarkably effective, creating a class of educated, loyal administrators who owe their power entirely to the emperor. The empire Otto leaves to his descendants is the most powerful state in Europe. It encompasses Germany, northern Italy, and Burgundy, controlling the Alpine passes that connect northern Europe to the Mediterranean. German emperors are crowned 3 times, first as King of Germany in Aachen, then as King of Italy in Milan or Pavia, and finally as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. This triple crown reflects the empire's multi-ethnic, multi-regional character, but also reveals its fundamental weakness. Unlike the emerging nation-states of Western Europe, the empire never develops a single identity, remaining instead a confederation of semi-autonomous territories united primarily through the person of the emperor. The Salian dynasty, which succeeds the Ottonians in 1024, reaches the height of imperial power under Henry III. Ruling from 1039 to 1056, Henry dominates both Germany and the papacy, deposing 3 rival popes in 1046 and appointing a series of reformist popes loyal to imperial interests. The empire appears invincible, its emperor the undisputed master of Western Christendom. But this very dominance plants the seeds of future conflict. The reform popes Henry appoints take their missions seriously, perhaps too seriously from the imperial perspective. They begin challenging the entire system of lay investiture, the practice of secular rulers appointing bishops and abbots. Pope Gregory VII, elected in 1073, declares that only the Pope has the authority to appoint bishops, directly threatening the Ottonian system that gives emperors control over the German church. The stage is set for the investiture controversy, a conflict that will shake the empire to its foundations. Henry IV, who becomes emperor after his father's death in 1056, inherits this crisis as a child. When he comes of age and attempts to exercise traditional imperial rights over the church, Gregory VII excommunicates him in 1076, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. The German nobles, always eager to limit royal power, revolt. Henry faces the collapse of his authority and makes a desperate gamble. In the harsh winter of 1077, he crosses the Alps and appears at Canossa, where Gregory is staying, as a barefoot penitent seeking forgiveness. The humiliation of Canossa becomes legendary. For 3 days, Henry stands in the snow outside the castle, dressed as a penitent, begging the Pope for absolution. Gregory, trapped by his own role as shepherd of souls, cannot refuse a penitent sinner and lifts the excommunication. But this apparent papal victory masks a shrewd political calculation by Henry. By receiving absolution, he legally reasserts his authority over the rebellious nobles, who no longer have religious justification for their revolt. The conflict between empire and papacy continues for decades, finally ending in a compromise in 1122 that splits the difference, allowing emperors some influence over bishop selection while granting the church ultimate spiritual authority. The investiture controversy fundamentally weakens imperial power. The long conflict allows German nobles to consolidate their autonomy, building castles and establishing hereditary control over their territories. The emperor's need to constantly fight in Italy to maintain imperial claims drains resources and attention from Germany. By the time the struggle ends, the German monarchy has lost its chance to develop the kind of centralized authority emerging in France and England. Yet the 12th century sees a remarkable revival of imperial prestige under the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Frederick I, known as Barbarossa for his red beard, becomes emperor in 1152 and dedicates his reign to restoring imperial glory. Tall, charismatic, and possessed of boundless energy, Frederick embodies the idealized medieval knight emperor. He leads 6 expeditions into Italy, attempting to assert imperial control over the wealthy Lombard cities that have grown increasingly independent. Frederick's vision of empire is grandiose and backward-looking. He styles himself the heir of ancient Rome and Charlemagne, insisting on his universal authority over all Christendom. At the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158, he proclaims imperial rights that would make him absolute master of Italy, claiming ancient Roman legal powers. The Italian cities, grown wealthy on Mediterranean trade, have no intention of submitting to a foreign emperor's taxation and control. They form the Lombard League, a confederation of cities that defeats Frederick's army at the Battle of Legnano in 1176, forcing him to recognize their autonomy. Despite these setbacks in Italy, Frederick Barbarossa succeeds in strengthening imperial authority in Germany itself. He elevates his supporters to positions of power, creates new territories for loyal vassals, and through marriage alliances, brings extensive lands under direct Hohenstaufen control. He transforms the Duchy of Austria into a privileged territory, granting it special autonomy that plants the seeds of future Habsburg power. He also pushes German expansion eastward, encouraging colonization of Slavic lands beyond the Elbe, where German settlers establish new towns and bring these territories into the empire's orbit. Frederick's death in 1190 has all the elements of medieval legend. An old man by the standards of his time, he nevertheless takes up the cross and joins the Third Crusade. While crossing a river in Anatolia, he drowns, his body found downstream, his army devastated by the loss of their charismatic leader. Legend later transforms this death into myth, claiming that Frederick sleeps in a mountain cave, his beard growing through the stone table, waiting to awaken when Germany needs him most. This Barbarossa myth will be invoked by later German nationalists, including the Nazis, who named their invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa. Frederick's son, Henry VI, inherits both the empire and, through marriage, the Kingdom of Sicily, creating a vast realm that stretches from the North Sea to North Africa. But Henry dies young in 1197, leaving only an infant son. The empire descends into civil war between rival candidates for the throne, a conflict that lasts 20 years and further erodes central authority. When Henry's son Frederick II finally secures the imperial title in 1220, he finds Germany so fragmented that he essentially abandons it, spending his reign in Sicily, creating a sophisticated Mediterranean kingdom, while leaving German princes to rule their territories as virtually independent sovereigns. Chapter 3: The Great Interregnum and the Rise of the Habsburgs. Frederick II's death in 1250 plunges the empire into its darkest period. The Great Interregnum, lasting from 1254 to 1273, sees multiple rival claimants to the imperial throne, none able to establish undisputed authority. Germany fragments into hundreds of virtually independent territories. Princes, bishops, and even cities establish themselves as sovereign entities, acknowledging no superior authority. The very concept of empire seems on the verge of extinction, the Reich reduced to little more than an honorific title without substance. During these chaotic decades, political power in Germany increasingly concentrates in the hands of a small group of great princes. 7 of them emerge as electors princes with the exclusive right to choose the emperor: the archbishops of Mainz-Trier, and Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. This electoral college formalizes what has been in formal practice, but it also ensures that imperial candidates must make concessions to secure election, further limiting the emperor's authority. The election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273 ends the interregnum but inaugurates a new reality. Rudolf is deliberately chosen because he is relatively weak, ruling only scattered territories in what is now Switzerland and Austria. The electors have no desire for a powerful emperor who might threaten their autonomy. Rudolf understands his position and focuses not on asserting imperial authority, but on expanding his family's hereditary lands. He conquers the wealthy Duchy of Austria from the rebellious King Ottokar of Bohemia, establishing the foundation of future Habsburg power. The Golden Bull of 1356, promulgated by Emperor Charles IV, codifies the empire's constitutional structure. This document, named for the golden seal attached to it, formally establishes the 7 electors and defines the electoral process in detail. It grants the electors virtual sovereignty in their territories, forbidding appeals from their courts to imperial courts, allowing them to mint coins, collect taxes, and maintain their own armies. The Golden Bull essentially transforms the Holy Roman Empire into an elective monarchy, where the emperor rules only with the consent and cooperation of the great princes. Yet despite this political fragmentation, the empire retains a powerful symbolic and emotional appeal. Germans continue to identify with the Reich, seeing themselves as heirs to Rome and to Charlemagne. The imperial title carries prestige that transcends its limited practical power. Cities flourish, developing sophisticated merchant guilds and proto-democratic governments. German culture flowers with magnificent Gothic cathedrals, university foundations, and a rich tradition of mystical theology and philosophy. The empire may be politically weak, but German civilization is vibrant and creative. The Habsburg dynasty gradually transforms the empire into their family inheritance. Through shrewd marriages, military conquests, and occasional elections, they accumulate vast territories. Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, parts of Italy, the Burgundian lands, and eventually Spain and its global empire. The famous motto, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry," reflects their strategy of expansion through dynastic politics rather than military conquest. By the early 16th century, the Habsburgs are Europe's preeminent dynasty, ruling territories on which, it is said, the sun never sets. The election of Charles V in 1519 seems to mark the zenith of Habsburg and imperial power. Charles inherits Spain and its American colonies from his maternal grandparents, the Burgundian Netherlands from his paternal grandmother, and the Austrian Habsburg lands from his paternal grandfather, in addition to being elected Holy Roman Emperor. He rules the largest empire since Charlemagne, stretching from Peru to Hungary, from Sicily to the Netherlands. Yet this vast realm proves impossible for one man to govern effectively, and Charles spends his reign rushing from crisis to crisis, never able to establish control over his unwieldy domains. Charles faces a crisis that will permanently transform both empire and Europe: the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, igniting a religious revolution that splits Western Christendom. Luther's rejection of papal authority and his doctrine of salvation by faith alone resonates deeply with Germans long resentful of Italian ecclesiastical domination and the flow of German wealth to Rome. Despite Charles's attempts to suppress the Reformation and restore religious unity, Protestantism spreads rapidly, especially among northern German princes who see religious reform as an opportunity to seize church lands and assert independence from imperial authority. The religious division becomes political and military conflict. Protestant princes form the Schmalkaldic League in 1531 to defend their faith and interests against the Catholic emperor. Charles eventually defeats them militarily in 1547, but cannot translate battlefield victory into lasting settlement. The princes simply will not return to Catholicism, and Charles lacks the resources for permanent occupation. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 recognizes this reality, establishing the principle of cuius regio, ius religio. Whoever rules the territory determines its religion. Princes can choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism, but not Calvinism or other Protestant variants for their territories, while allowing subjects who disagree a right to emigrate. The Peace of Augsburg represents another victory for princely autonomy over imperial authority. Religious choice becomes another aspect of sovereignty that princes exercise independently. The empire, once conceived as a universal Christian commonwealth, is now officially divided along confessional lines. Charles V, exhausted and disillusioned, abdicates in 1556, dividing his vast domains between his son Philip, who receives Spain and its empire, and his brother Ferdinand, who inherits the Austrian lands and the imperial title. The Habsburg domain split into Spanish and Austrian branches, each pursuing its own interests. Under Ferdinand I and his successors, the Austrian Habsburgs focus increasingly on their hereditary lands in Central and Eastern Europe, rather than on the empire as a whole. The Turkish threat to Vienna, recurring conflicts with Bohemian and Hungarian subjects, and the management of a multi-ethnic realm demand their attention. The empire becomes almost a side concern, its institutions weakened, its diet rarely meeting, its circles of mutual defense barely functioning. Religious tensions continue to simmer despite the Peace of Augsburg. Calvinism spreads in the Palatinate and other territories, but lacks legal recognition. Catholic counter-Reformation efforts, led by the Jesuits, attempt to win back territories lost to Protestantism. Both sides establish confessional alliances, the Protestant Union in 1608 and the Catholic League in 1609, preparing for conflict. Local disputes increasingly take on confessional dimensions, as Protestant and Catholic princes see every controversy through the lens of religious struggle. The empire stands on the brink of catastrophe. Chapter 4. The 30 Years' War and the Empire's Near Death. The defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618, unleashes the most devastating conflict in German history before the 20th century. Bohemian Protestant nobles, furious at Habsburg attempts to restrict their religious freedoms and political privileges, storm the Prague castle and throw two imperial governors and their secretary out the window. All three survive the 70-foot fall, landing in a dung heap. But the incident ignites a war that will consume Germany for 3 decades. What begins as a Bohemian revolt against Habsburg authority rapidly metastasizes into a German-wide religious war. Then a European struggle for power involving every major state. The Bohemian rebels offer their crown to Frederick V, the Calvinist Elector Palatine and son-in-law of the English king. Emperor Ferdinand II, deeply Catholic and determined to restore Habsburg authority, strikes back with ferocity. At the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, Imperial and Bavarian Catholic forces crush the Bohemian army. Frederick flees, earning the mocking title Winter King for his brief reign. Ferdinand unleashes a savage repression on Bohemia, executing rebel leaders, confiscating Protestant estates, and forcibly re-Catholicizing the population. Emboldened by victory, Ferdinand and his brilliant general, Albrecht von Wallenstein, press forward. Imperial armies push northward, defeating Protestant forces and reclaiming territories for Catholicism. By 1629, Ferdinand feels confident enough to issue the Edict of Restitution, demanding that all church lands secularized since 1552 be returned to Catholic control. This would mean massive transfers of territory and wealth, threatening dozens of Protestant princes with dispossession. The emperor appears on the verge of transforming the empire into an absolute Catholic monarchy, destroying the religious settlement of 1555 and crushing princely independence. But Ferdinand's very success brings powerful enemies into the war. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a brilliant military innovator and devout Lutheran, lands in Germany in 1630, ostensibly to defend Protestant interests, but also seeking to make Sweden the dominant Baltic power. With mobile artillery, innovative tactics, and highly trained troops, Gustavus smashes through imperial armies. At Breitenfeld in 1631, he destroys the supposedly invincible forces of the Catholic League. Protestant Germany hails him as the Lion of the North, a divinely sent savior come to rescue German Protestantism. Gustavus drives deep into Germany, his victorious army reaching Bavaria and threatening Austria itself. But at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, fighting in dense fog, a Swedish victory turns to tragedy when Gustavus himself falls in combat. His death removes the one Protestant commander capable of decisively defeating the Habsburgs. Yet the war continues, now driven more by dynastic ambition and foreign intervention than religious zeal. Cardinal Richelieu, the brilliant power behind the French throne, recognizes an opportunity. Though France is Catholic, Richelieu cares more about breaking Habsburg power than defending religious unity. French gold flows to Sweden and to Protestant German princes, subsidizing their continued resistance. Then in 1635, France itself enters the war directly, attacking Spanish possessions in the Netherlands and Italy. The conflict that began as a German religious dispute has become a European power struggle, with Germany as the battlefield. The nature of warfare itself makes the 30 Years' War uniquely devastating. Early modern armies, too large to be supplied by traditional logistics, live off the land they traverse. Soldiers receive little pay and compensate themselves through plunder. Armies moving through Germany strip the countryside bare, requisitioning food, livestock, and valuables, leaving starving populations in their wake. Peasants flee to walled cities, spreading disease. Plague and typhus rage through crowded urban populations and military camps alike. Towns change hands repeatedly, subjected to siege, storm, and sack. The military entrepreneur Albrecht von Wallenstein exemplifies the war's character. Wallenstein raises and maintains entire armies at his own expense, recouping costs by allowing his troops to plunder conquered territories. He amasses enormous wealth while laying waste to vast regions. When his political intrigues make him a liability to Ferdinand, the emperor has him assassinated in 1634, but Wallenstein's system of warfare continues. The war feeds on itself, as armies must keep fighting and plundering simply to survive. By the 1640s, all sides are exhausted. German territories are depopulated and economically devastated. The great powers, France, Sweden, Spain, Austria, are financially drained. Negotiations begin at Westphalia in 1644, though fighting continues even as diplomats debate. The Peace Congress itself reflects the war's complexity, requiring simultaneous negotiations in two cities, Munster and Osnabrück, to accommodate the various powers and their religious sensitivities. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, reshapes the German political and religious landscape. Calvinism receives legal recognition alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, is reaffirmed but modified, with specific provisions protecting religious minorities. Territorially, France gains Alsace. Sweden obtains Western Pomerania and other Baltic territories, and Switzerland and the Dutch Netherlands receive formal recognition of their independence from the empire. More fundamentally, the peace grants German princes full sovereignty in their territories, including the right to conduct foreign policy and make alliances, even against the emperor. The Holy Roman Empire survives, but is little more than a loose confederation of independent states. The human cost is staggering. Estimates suggest Germany's population declined from about 21 million to perhaps 13 million a loss of nearly 40%. Some regions fare even worse, with parts of Württemberg, Brandenburg, and Pomerania losing half or more of their inhabitants. Farmland returns to forest. Towns lie in ruins. The economic and demographic damage requires generations to heal. The war's trauma becomes seared into German collective memory, a cautionary tale about religious fanaticism and political fragmentation. Chapter 5. The Rise of Prussia. From the ashes of the 30 Years' War, an unlikely power emerges in Germany's northeast. Brandenburg, a poor and sandy territory, hardly seems destined for greatness. Its ruling family, the Hohenzollerns, control a scattered collection of lands, including Brandenburg itself, the Duchy of Prussia on the Baltic coast, and various smaller territories in western Germany. These disconnected possessions lack natural resources, navigable rivers, or significant population. Yet over the next 2 centuries, the Hohenzollerns will transform these unpromising materials into a great power that eventually unites Germany. Frederick William, the Great Elector, begins this transformation during his reign from 1640 to 1688. Returning to Brandenburg during the 30 Years' War, the young ruler finds his territories devastated, his capital Berlin half depopulated, his treasury empty. Where other German princes accept their weakened condition, Frederick William draws different lessons. He concludes that survival requires military strength, efficient administration, and independence from the empire's chaotic politics. Frederick William builds a standing army, small at first, but disciplined and well-trained. He establishes the General War Commissariat, a centralized bureaucracy that collects taxes, supplies troops, and gradually extends state control over previously autonomous noble privileges. He welcomes refugees, particularly French Huguenots fleeing Louis XIV's persecution after 1685, offering them land and religious freedom. These immigrants bring skills, capital, and entrepreneurial energy to Brandenburg, Prussia. The Great Elector plays European powers off each other, switching alliances to extract maximum advantage. His small but effective army making Brandenburg, Prussia a valued ally despite its modest size. When Frederick William's son crowns himself king in Prussia in 1701, taking the title Frederick I, he elevates the Hohenzollern dynasty to royal status. The title is carefully phrased in not of Prussia because the Duchy of Prussia lies outside the Holy Roman Empire, allowing the Hohenzollerns to claim royal dignity without implying sovereignty over the empire's territories. Nevertheless, the message is clear. Brandenburg, Prussia is no longer merely another German principality but an emerging power worthy of recognition. Frederick William I, the Soldier King, ruling from 1713 to 1740, intensifies his grandfather's military focus to almost pathological levels. This strange, volatile monarch transforms Prussia into a militarized state where army and bureaucracy fuse into a single instrument of royal power. He cuts court expenditure to the bone, lives frugally, and channels every spare thaler into his army. By his death, Prussia's standing army numbers 83,000 men, the third or fourth largest in Europe, supporting by a population of only 2.5 million. The ratio of soldiers to population is the highest in Europe, making Prussia, in the famous phrase, not a country with an army, but an army with a country. The Soldier King's obsession extends to recruiting tall soldiers for his personal guard regiment. He scours Europe for men over 6 feet, sometimes resorting to kidnapping. This giant regiment becomes his pride, though he never uses it in combat, preferring to drill these massive grenadiers endlessly. His relationship with his son and heir, Frederick, is poisonous. The sensitive, flute-playing crown prince loves philosophy, music, and French culture, everything his brutish father despises. Frederick William beats his son, humiliates him publicly, and when the young prince attempts to flee to England, the king has Frederick's accomplice executed before his eyes. Yet this traumatic relationship perhaps prepares Frederick for the ruthless world of 18th century power politics. Frederick II, later called Frederick the Great, inherits the throne in 1740 and immediately demonstrates that beneath his cultured exterior lies a calculating military genius. Within months of his accession, he invades Silesia, Austria's wealthy province, exploiting the succession crisis created when Maria Theresa inherits the Habsburg domains. Frederick offers no justification beyond naked self-interest, later writing, "Silesia was the object, the means we had, and the desire for glory. These were the reasons for going to war." This cynical honesty characterizes his entire reign. The War of the Austrian Succession and the subsequent 7 Years' War see Frederick battling coalitions of great powers, often against desperate odds. His military brilliance saves Prussia repeatedly. At Rossbach in 1757, he crushes a Franco-imperial army twice his size. At Leuthen, weeks later, he defeats an Austrian force outnumbering him 2-1 through a daring oblique attack that becomes legendary. These victories establish Frederick as history's great captain alongside Alexander and Napoleon. Yet they come at enormous cost. Prussia loses over 180,000 soldiers during the 7 Years' War, and Frederick's tactics, aggressive frontal assaults by rigidly drilled infantry, produce horrific casualties. Frederick's survival and retention of Silesia depends partly on fortune. When Russia's Empress Elizabeth dies in 1762, her heir, Peter III, idolizes Frederick and immediately withdraws from the coalition fighting Prussia. This miracle of the House of Brandenburg saves Frederick from likely defeat. Yet, it also reveals Prussia's fundamental vulnerability, a mid-sized power constantly threatened by larger neighbors, surviving through military excellence and diplomatic agility rather than inherent strength. Peace allows Frederick to reveal other dimensions of his genius. He reforms Prussian law, abolishes torture, promotes religious tolerance, and encourages agricultural improvements. He corresponds with Voltaire and other philosophes, styling himself an enlightened absolute monarch. His economic policies, though mercantilist and protectionist by later standards, promote industry and rebuild war-damaged territories. He drains swamps, establishes colonies on newly cultivated land, and implements a comprehensive system of state-directed economic development. Yet Frederick remains fundamentally a military monarch. His state exists for war, and his social policies reflect this priority. The Junker nobility receives special privileges in return for officer service. Peasants on noble estates remain enserfed, providing sons for the ranks while nobles provide officers. This social bargain creates a powerful military instrument but freezes Prussian society in pre-modern hierarchical patterns, even as Western Europe moves toward greater social mobility. Frederick's reign ends in 1786, with Prussia established as one of Europe's 5 great powers, an astonishing achievement for a state that barely existed a century earlier. Yet his success creates problems. Frederick is irreplaceable, a genius whose personal abilities compensate for Prussia's structural weaknesses. His successors, lacking his brilliance, will struggle to maintain his legacy. Moreover, Frederick's Prussia is militarily formidable but economically and socially backward, a brittle power that the coming revolutionary age will nearly shatter. Chapter 6: Napoleon and the Empire's End. The French Revolution unleashes forces that will destroy the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire. When revolutionary France declares war on Austria in 1792, it ignites a quarter-century of conflict that reshapes Europe. Initially, the old powers expect to easily suppress the revolutionary upstart. The Duke of Brunswick's manifesto threatens Paris with destruction if the French royal family is harmed. Instead, French revolutionary armies, animated by nationalist fervor and led by talented officers promoted by merit rather than birth, defeat the professional armies of the monarchies. Austria and Prussia, distracted by partitioning Poland and suspicious of each other, failed to coordinate effectively against France. The empire's institutions prove wholly inadequate for modern warfare. The imperial diet debates while French armies overrun the Rhineland. Individual states make separate peace treaties with France, abandoning the collective defense that theoretically binds the empire together. By 1795, Prussia withdraws from the war entirely, leaving Austria to fight alone. The empire, long a shadow of its medieval self, reveals itself as completely hollow. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power accelerates the empire's disintegration. After his coup d'etat in 1799, Napoleon combines revolutionary energy with his own strategic genius to dominate Europe. His victory at Marengo in 1800 forces Austria to recognize French control of territories up to the Rhine. The Treaty of Landval in 1801 cedes the entire left bank of the Rhine to France, eliminating numerous small ecclesiastical states and imperial free cities that have existed for centuries. To compensate displaced rulers, the imperial recess of 1803 drastically restructures Germany, secularizing church states and mediatizing free cities, concentrating power in fewer, larger states like Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg. This reorganization, ironically, modernizes Germany. The hundreds of tiny principalities, ecclesiastical territories, and free cities that made the empire a geographical absurdity are swept away. The surviving states must modernize their administrations, codify laws, and improve governance to compete and survive. Many adopt French-inspired legal codes, abolish serfdom, and reduce noble privileges. Napoleon's impact is destructive, but also catalytic, forcing changes that German states would likely never have undertaken voluntarily. Austria, still claiming to speak for the empire, continues resisting Napoleon with disastrous results. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon destroys a combined Austro-Russian army in what he considers his most perfect battle. Emperor Francis II, humiliated in recognizing reality, takes a momentous step. On August 6, 1806, he dissolves the Holy Roman Empire. Laying down the crown his family has worn almost continuously since 1438. Francis continues ruling as Emperor of Austria, but the title Holy Roman Emperor disappears, ending an institution that has lasted since Charlemagne's coronation over 1,000 years earlier. Napoleon organizes most of Western and Southern Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, a French satellite that provides troops for his armies and pays subsidies to France. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and other states become French allies, their princes elevated to kings and grand dukes, binding them to Napoleon through self-interest. Prussia, humiliated and isolated, attempts neutrality, avoiding French wrath while avoiding commitment. This pusillanimous policy collapses in 1806 when Prussia finally challenges Napoleon, driven by a war party led by Queen Louise and young officers disgusted by their state's degradation. Prussian armies march forward with the confidence born of Frederick the Great's victories, expecting to humble the Corsican upstart. Instead, Napoleon destroys Prussia's army in twin battles at Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806. Within weeks, French cavalry ride through Berlin. The king and queen flee to East Prussia, their kingdom reduced to a fraction of its former territory by the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Prussia's catastrophic defeat forces fundamental reform. A group of enlightened officials, including Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau, implement sweeping changes. They abolish serfdom, reform the administration, modernize the military, and establish a new education system based on Humboldtian ideals of self-cultivation through learning. These Prussian reforms aim to transform subjects into citizens, creating a more dynamic society capable of generating the energy and commitment that animated French revolutionary armies. Yet the reformers operate within a fundamentally conservative framework, preserving monarchy and noble privilege while modernizing around them. German nationalism, previously a cultural movement of poets and philosophers, begins acquiring political edge under French occupation. Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivers his addresses to the German nation in occupied Berlin, calling for German cultural renewal and unity. Students form gymnastic societies and patriotic associations, dreaming of a united Germany free from French domination. The wars of liberation of 1813 to 1815 channel this emerging nationalism as Germans rally to drive out Napoleon. Volunteers flood to the colors when Prussia finally joins the Sixth Coalition against France. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations in October 1813 combined German, Russian, and Austrian forces defeat Napoleon, liberating Germany. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815 reorganizes Europe after Napoleon's defeat. For Germany, the great powers create the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states ranging from Prussia and Austria to tiny principalities. The Confederation has a permanent Diet meeting in Frankfurt under Austrian presidency, but no central government, no unified military, and no real authority over member states. Metternich, Austria's brilliant conservative chancellor, designs this system deliberately to maintain Austrian influence while preventing German unity, which would threaten Austrian interests. The post-Napoleonic settlement tries to restore the pre-revolutionary order, yet recognizes that complete restoration is impossible. Most territorial changes from the Napoleonic era remain. Constitutions granted during the Reform period are largely retained. The Confederation's constitution promises representative institutions, though most states implement this provision minimally. Prussia retains the Rhineland and Westphalia, making it Germany's dominant Protestant power and bringing industrializing regions under Prussian control. This acquisition will prove fateful, linking Prussia's future to economic modernization. The 1815 settlement, intended to ensure stability and preserve monarchical legitimacy, instead plants seeds of future conflict. German nationalism, awakened by the French occupation, does not dissipate with Napoleon's defeat, but continues developing through cultural movements, student associations, and liberal political agitation. The German Confederation, designed to prevent unity, becomes instead the framework within which the struggle for German unification will unfold. Chapter 7. The Long Road to Unity. The decades following 1815 see Germany caught between forces of change and preservation. Metternich's system maintains monarchical legitimacy and Austrian hegemony through censorship, police surveillance, and suppression of liberal and nationalist movements. The Carlsbad Decrees of 1819, issued after a nationalist student assassinates a conservative playwright, impose strict controls on universities, establish censorship, and ban nationalist organizations. Metternich's spies infiltrate suspect groups, and political dissidents face imprisonment or exile. Yet beneath this repressive surface, Germany transforms. The Industrial Revolution arrives, first in the Rhineland and Silesia, then spreading eastward. Coal mines, iron foundries, and textile mills multiply. Railroads, that revolutionary new technology, begin crisscrossing German states, annihilating distance and creating unified economic spaces where political boundaries previously fragmented commerce. The first German railroad, from Nuremberg to Fürth in 1835, is merely a novelty, but by 1850, thousands of miles of track connect German cities and regions. Prussia's creation of the Zollverein, the customs union, in 1834, proves crucial. By eliminating tariffs between member states, the Zollverein creates a large unified market that accelerates industrialization. Most German states join, attracted by economic benefits and Prussian leadership. Austria, with its vast non-German territories and different economic interests, stays outside. The Zollverein does not create political unity, but it establishes Prussian economic hegemony and begins habituating Germans to think in terms of a unified economic space. Economic integration precedes political unification. The revolutions of 1848 seemed to promise dramatic change. Inspired by the February Revolution in Paris, demonstrations erupt across Germany demanding constitutions, civil rights, and national unity. Rulers, surprised and frightened, make hasty concessions. In Frankfurt, a national assembly convenes to write a constitution for a unified Germany. Educated liberals and moderate nationalists debate the shape of future German unity in the historic Pulskirche, producing draft constitutions and debating profound questions about German identity and political organization. The Frankfurt Parliament grapples with fundamental dilemmas. Should united Germany include Austria with its non-German territories, grow Deutsch solution, or exclude Austria and unite around Prussia, Klein Deutsch solution? Should the new state be federalized, preserving existing kingdoms and principalities, or centralized? How much power should the parliament hold versus the hereditary emperor? These questions prove divisive. Meanwhile, the assembly lacks military force or administrative machinery to implement its decisions. It is a parliament without power, debating in a vacuum while realities shift around it. By autumn 1848, conservative forces rally. Austrian General Windisch-Graetz suppresses revolution in Vienna. Prussian troops crush rebellion in Berlin. The tide turns decisively against revolution. When the Frankfurt Parliament finally offers the German crown to Prussian King Frederick William IV in early 1849, he contemptuously refuses a crown from the gutter, declining an office offered by popular representatives rather than fellow monarchs. Prussian soldiers disperse the remaining delegates. The revolution collapses, leaving only modest constitutional reforms in some states. The failure of 1848 teaches harsh lessons. Liberal idealism cannot overcome entrenched power without military force. Political unity will not emerge from parliamentary debate, but must be imposed by one of Germany's existing powers. The army, not the parliament, holds real power in German politics. These lessons are absorbed by a Prussian Junker politician named Otto von Bismarck, who emerges from the 1850s convinced that Prussia must lead German unification, but through iron and blood, rather than speeches and resolutions. Bismarck becomes Minister-President of Prussia in 1862 during a constitutional crisis. The liberal-dominated Prussian parliament refuses to fund army reforms proposed by King William I and his military chiefs. Bismarck, appointed to break the deadlock, simply collects taxes and implements the reforms without parliamentary approval. This brazen unconstitutionality outrages liberals, who denounce Bismarck as a reactionary tyrant. Bismarck doesn't care about liberal opinion. He cares about power, and he understands that whoever controls the army controls Prussia, and whoever controls Prussia can shape Germany's future. Bismarck's strategy for German unification is cunning and ruthless. He will use Prussian military power to defeat Austria and exclude it from Germany, then unite the remaining German states under Prussian leadership. But he must do this without triggering intervention by France or Russia, and he must make Prussia's domination appear as German national unification rather than naked Prussian imperialism. This requires diplomatic genius combined with military victories. The Danish War of 1864 provides Bismarck's opening. When Denmark attempts to incorporate the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, German nationalist opinion is outraged. Bismarck convinces Austria to join Prussia in a war against Denmark, which Prussia's modernized army easily wins. But the victory creates new problems. How to administer the conquered duchies? Bismarck uses these disputes to engineer a crisis with Austria, deliberately making the conflict inevitable while appearing reasonable to other powers. War comes in 1866, and it shocks Europe. Prussia's reformed military, using railroads for rapid mobilization, breech-loading rifles for firepower, and Moltke's brilliant planning for coordination, destroys Austria's army at Königgrätz in Bohemia. The battle lasts a single day, July 3, 1866, but it reshapes German politics permanently. Austria is expelled from German affairs, leaving Prussia dominant. Bismarck resists demands from William I and the generals to march on Vienna, recognizing that a humiliated Austria might seek revenge, while a lenient peace will leave Austria potentially neutral in future conflicts. The Treaty of Prague dissolves the German Confederation and creates the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership, excluding Austria. Chapter 8. Blood and Iron. The Second Reich, Prussia's victory over Austria in 1866, leaves one obstacle to German unification: France. Napoleon III, France's emperor, watches German unification warily, recognizing that a united Germany threatens France's European dominance. Bismarck understands that French opposition must be overcome, preferably through war that makes France appear the aggressor, rallying German nationalist sentiment to Prussia's side. He waits for opportunity, and it comes through a dynastic dispute in Spain. When the Spanish throne becomes vacant in 1868, various candidates emerge, including a Hohenzollern prince. French diplomacy objects strenuously to having Hohenzollerns on both German and Spanish thrones, seeing it as encirclement. King William I, vacationing at Bad Ems, meets the French ambassador and courteously declines French demands. He telegrams Bismarck describing this encounter. Bismarck edits the Ems dispatch, abbreviating it to make it appear that William rudely rebuffed the French ambassador. When published, the edited telegram inflames public opinion in both countries. France declares war in July 1870. The Franco-Prussian War reveals French military inferiority starkly. Prussian mobilization, planned to the last detail, assembles overwhelming force on the frontier, while French armies struggle with chaotic organization. Moltke's strategy of encirclement leads to French defeats at Worth and Spicheren. Then the disaster at Sedan on September 1, 1870. Napoleon III and an entire French army surrender. Paris endures siege through the bitter winter of 1870–71. The population reduced to eating zoo animals and rats. Finally, France capitulates, accepting harsh terms including massive indemnity and loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Before the war ends, Bismarck consummates German unification. The southern German states, Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, join the North German Confederation, creating a united German empire. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, King William I of Prussia is proclaimed German emperor. The choice of location, the palace of Louis XIV, symbol of French glory, deliberately humiliates France, while the date commemorates the founding of the Prussian kingdom in 1701. This is Prussia's triumph, the Second Reich, and it is born in French defeat. The new German Empire is Prussian-dominated, but federal in structure. Each kingdom, Grand Duchy, and Principality retains its monarchy and internal administration. However, Prussia comprises 2/3 of the empire's territory and population, controls foreign and military policy, and its king automatically holds the imperial title. The constitution Bismarck designs grants universal male suffrage for the Reichstag, the federal parliament, but real power rests with the Kaiser and the government he appoints. The Reichstag can debate and must approve legislation, but cannot form or dismiss governments. This semi-constitutional system allows Bismarck to play democratic and aristocratic elements against each other. Bismarck's domestic policies combine conservatism with pragmatic flexibility. When the Catholic Center Party emerges as a powerful force, threatening Protestant Prussian dominance, Bismarck launches the Kulturkampf, a struggle against Catholic political influence. Laws restrict Jesuit activities, place education under state control, and require civil marriage. Yet when these measures backfire, strengthening Catholic solidarity, Bismarck abandons the campaign, needing Catholic support against a rising Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrats pose a different threat, a mass working-class party committed to socialism, organizing industrial workers and winning growing electoral support. Bismarck responds with a two-pronged strategy. First, he outlaws the Social Democratic Party in 1878, banning its organizations and publications. Second, he implements path-breaking social insurance programs, health insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, old age pensions in 1889, creating the world's first comprehensive welfare state. Bismarck, as a aim, is to wean workers from socialism by demonstrating that the conservative state can better serve their interests than revolutionary movements. These social insurance programs, though designed for political purposes, represent genuine innovation. Germany becomes a model for other nations seeking to manage industrial society's social tensions. The welfare state becomes a permanent feature of German politics, surviving Bismarck, the empire, and even National Socialism to shape modern Germany's social market economy. In foreign policy, Bismarck pursues a complex system of alliances designed to preserve German security and prevent hostile coalitions. His nightmare is a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. Therefore, he maintains friendly relations with Russia through the Reinsurance Treaty, allies with Austria-Hungary in the Dual Alliance, and brings Italy into a Triple Alliance. He encouraged French colonial expansion in Africa and Asia, hoping to divert French attention from Alsace-Lorraine and create friction between France and Britain. His system is intricate, sometimes contradictory, but effective while he manages it. Germany industrializes rapidly under unification. Coal production soars, steel mills proliferate, chemical and electrical industries emerge. By 1900, Germany rivals Britain as Europe's leading industrial power. Cities mushroom as peasants flood to factory jobs. Berlin transforms from a provincial capital into a metropolis of 2 million. This economic dynamism creates social tensions between workers and factory owners, between traditional rural society and urban industrial modernity, between old aristocratic elites and new industrial capitalists. The empire's political system, designed for a pre-industrial age, struggles to manage these tensions. German culture flourishes. Universities become world leaders in science, philosophy, and scholarship. German music, from Brahms to Wagner to Richard Strauss, dominates European concert halls. German technology and engineering become synonymous with quality and precision. Yet beneath this confident facade, the Wilhelmine Empire contains unresolved contradictions. Its political system grants democratic forms while preserving aristocratic substance. Its rapid industrial growth creates social classes whose interests clash fundamentally. Its foreign policy success depends on Bismarck's complex balancing act, which requires his personal management to sustain. When Wilhelm II becomes Kaiser in 1888 at age 29, he determines to rule as well as reign. The young emperor is intelligent but unstable, creating glory and recognition, alternately bombastic and insecure. He clashes with Bismarck over policies and personalities, forcing the Iron Chancellor to resign in 1890. Wilhelm proclaims he will now steer the ship of state himself. His personal rule will lead the empire to catastrophe. Chapter 9. Hubris and Catastrophe. The Great War Wilhelm II abandons Bismarck's careful diplomatic system almost immediately. He allows the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia to lapse in 1890, driving Russia into French arms. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 creates exactly the two-front threat Bismarck spent his career preventing. Wilhelm's unpredictable foreign policy, alternating between aggressive posturing and sudden retreats, confuses both allies and opponents, earning him distrust without gaining advantage. German Weltpolitik. Wilhelm's policy of claiming Germany's place in the sun as a world power further alienates other powers. Germany demands colonies, though most desirable territories are already claimed. The Kaiser orders construction of a powerful battle fleet to rival Britain's navy. Admiral von Tirpitz's Navy laws authorize massive battleship construction, justified by dubious theories that Britain will seek German alliance rather than risk its naval supremacy. Instead, Britain views the German fleet as an existential threat, pushing Britain toward France and Russia, despite decades of colonial rivalry with those powers. The Anglo-French Entente of 1904 and Anglo-Russian Understanding of 1907 complete Germany's encirclement. The Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia faces the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Europe divides into armed camps, each expanding military forces, each viewing the other with suspicion. A series of crises: Morocco in 1905 and 1911, Bosnia in 1908 to 1909 ratchet up tensions without producing resolution. Germany feels increasingly surrounded, the victim of a conspiracy to contain its rightful power. Its opponents see an aggressive, unpredictable Germany threatening European peace. The Balkan Wars of 1912–1913 destabilize southeastern Europe as Serbian nationalism threatens Austria-Hungary's South Slav territories. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, is assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by a Serbian nationalist, Austria sees an opportunity to crush Serbian pretensions. Germany offers its ally a blank check, promising support whatever Austria decides. Austria presents Serbia with an ultimatum deliberately drafted to be unacceptable, then declares war on July 28. The alliance system and military timetables now take control. Russia mobilizes to support Serbia, its Slavic client. Germany demands Russia halt mobilization, and when Russia refuses, declares war on Russia on August 1st, and on France on August 3rd. German military planning, embodied in the Schlieffen Plan, requires immediate invasion of France through Belgium to achieve quick victory before Russia fully mobilizes. Belgium's neutrality, guaranteed by treaty, is dismissed as a scrap of paper by German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. German violation of Belgian neutrality brings Britain into the war on August 4th. The German army crashes into Belgium and France with terrifying power. German troops burn Louvain, execute Belgian civilians accused of resisting, and push toward Paris. The Schlieffen Plan calls for enveloping the French armies from the north while they attack into Alsace-Lorraine. But Chief of Staff Moltke, nephew of the great Moltke, has modified the plan, weakening the crucial right wing. When French and British forces counterattack at the Marne in September, the German advance stops. Both sides dig trenches from Switzerland to the North Sea. The war of movement becomes a war of attrition. On the Eastern Front, Germany wins spectacular victories. At Tannenberg in August 1914, Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff destroy entire Russian army, taking nearly 100,000 prisoners. German offensives drive deep into Russian territory. Yet Russia's vast spaces and enormous population allow it to absorb these defeats and raise new armies. Germany cannot achieve decisive victory in the east, while locked in stalemate in the west. The war becomes an industrial slaughter. At Verdun in 1916, Germany attempts to bleed France white, calculating that France will sacrifice its army defending the fortress. Instead, both sides bleed together. Nearly 1 million casualties for negligible gain. The Somme offensive later that year sees British forces suffer 60,000 casualties on the first day, ultimate proving equally futile. New weapons, poison gas, machine guns, artillery firing millions of shells make defense nearly impregnable. Attacks achieve small gains at enormous cost. Germany's home front struggles under Allied blockade. Britain's naval power chokes off imports, creating food shortages and rationing. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 sees Germans subsisting on turnips and ersatz foods as caloric intake plummets. Strikes and unrest spread as civilian suffering intensifies. The military increasingly dominates government, with Hindenburg and Ludendorff forming a virtual military dictatorship after 1916, sidelining civilian leadership. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917 brings the United States into the war. Germany calculates that submarine warfare will strangle Britain before American mobilization matters. The calculation proves disastrously wrong. American entry guarantees eventual Allied material superiority while providing negligible German benefit. Wilson's US-14 points offer a vision of a negotiated peace based on national self-determination and a League of Nations, appealing to war-weary populations and providing ideological justification for Allied victory. Russia's collapse offers temporary respite. Revolution overthrows the Tsar in March 1917, and the Bolshevik coup in November leads to Russia's exit from the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 imposes harsh terms on Russia, annexing vast territories and demonstrating Germany's war aims. Germany can now concentrate all forces in the West for a final offensive before American troops arrive in strength. The spring offensives of 1918 are Germany's last gamble. Using new stormtrooper tactics, German forces break through Allied lines, advancing further than at any time since 1914. Paris comes under long-range artillery bombardment. But German advances, though dramatic, are not decisive. The army lacks reserves to exploit breakthroughs. Allied lines bend but do not break. By summer, Allied counteroffensives, now including American divisions, pushed Germany back. With American forces flooding into France, German defeat becomes inevitable. The home front collapses in autumn 1918. Mutiny breaks out in the High Seas Fleet when ordered to sortie for a final suicidal battle. Revolution spreads from Kiel to other cities as sailors and workers' councils proclaim a republic. The Kaiser abdicates on November 9th and flees to Holland. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, the armistice takes effect. Germany has lost the war, exhausted militarily and collapsing internally. Over 2 million German soldiers are dead. The economy is shattered, and revolution threatens the social order. Chapter 10. Weimar's Troubled Democracy. The German Revolution of November 1918 occurs more through collapse than conscious overthrow. The Kaiser abdicates, but no clear alternative government exists. Philipp Scheidmann, a social democratic leader, proclaims the republic from a Reichstag window, fearing that radical Spartacists might declare a Soviet-style government. The same day, Karl Liebknecht does precisely that, announcing a socialist republic. Germany faces the possibility of civil war between moderate socialists and revolutionary communists. Friedrich Ebert, leader of the Social Democrats, becomes provisional chancellor. A pragmatic moderate, Ebert fears Bolshevik revolution more than he desires socialist transformation. He strikes a fateful bargain with the military high command. The army will support the republic and suppress radical revolution if Ebert preserves the existing officer corps and opposes military reform. This Ebert-Groener pact ensures immediate stability but leaves the army as a state within a state, hostile to republican democracy and loyal to traditional conservatism. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after Franz Ferdinand's assassination, imposes harsh terms on Germany. The famous War Guilt Clause assigns Germany responsibility for starting the war. Germany loses all colonies, 13% of European territory, and 10% of population, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor and Upper Silesia to the new Polish state, and smaller territories to Belgium and Denmark. The German military is limited to 100,000 men, forbidden to possess tanks, aircraft, submarines, or heavy artillery. Most controversially, Germany must pay enormous reparations, the amount to be determined later, but clearly intended to be punitive. Germans react to Versailles with fury and disbelief. Virtually all political parties denounce it as unjust, a diktat imposed by victors on a defenseless, defeated nation. The stab-in-the-back myth gains currency, claiming that Germany's army remained undefeated in the field, but was betrayed by civilian politicians, socialists, and Jews who sued for peace. This legend, though historically baseless, becomes powerful political ammunition for right-wing opponents of the Republic. The Weimar Republic, as the new democratic Germany is called, bears from birth the stigma of accepting the shameful peace. The Republic faces immediate threats from both left and right. In January 1919, the Spartacist uprising attempts communist revolution in Berlin. Ebert uses Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary formations composed of demobilized soldiers, to crush the revolt. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, communist leaders, are murdered after capture. Short-lived Soviet republics in Munich and other cities meet similar fates. Yet the right poses equal danger. In March 1920, the Kapp Putsch sees Freikorps units attempt to overthrow the government, failing only when trade unions call a general strike that paralyzes the economy. Political violence becomes endemic. Between 1919 and 1922, right-wing extremists assassinate over 300 political opponents, including Matthias Erzberger, who signed the armistice, and Walter Rathenau, the Jewish foreign minister. Courts, staffed by conservative judges hostile to the Republic, impose minimal sentences on right-wing terrorists while harshly punishing leftist violence. The judiciary, like the military, remains unreconstructed, loyal to pre-Republican values. Hyperinflation devastates the economy and traumatizes German society. War financing through debt rather than taxation, continued deficits after the war, and massive reparations obligations create inflationary pressure. When France occupies the Ruhr industrial region in 1923 to enforce reparations, the government responds with passive resistance, printing money to support striking workers. Inflation spirals into hyperinflation. The mark, valued at 4.2 to the dollar in 1914, reaches 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. Life savings evaporate. Pensioners and middle-class savers are wiped out. Workers receive wages twice daily, rushing to spend them before further depreciation. The hyperinflation ends when the government introduces a new currency, the Rentenmark, in November 1923, and finally stabilizes finances. But the social and psychological damage endures. The middle class, cornerstone of democratic society, feels betrayed by the republic that destroyed their savings. This trauma makes many Germans receptive to extremist politics promising stability and revenge. Yet the mid-1920s bring relative stability. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructures reparations on a more realistic basis and provides American loans to rebuild the German economy. Gustav Stresemann, serving as chancellor and then foreign minister, pursues a policy of fulfillment, meeting treaty obligations while negotiating their revision through diplomacy. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 normalize relations with Western powers. Germany joins the League of Nations in 1926. Cultural life flourishes as Weimar Berlin becomes legendary for artistic experimentation and social liberalism. The Golden Twenties, as Germans remember them, see remarkable cultural creativity. Expressionist cinema produces masterpieces like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Metropolis. The Bauhaus revolutionizes architecture and design. Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, and other writers explore modernity's discontents. Weimar culture is cosmopolitan, experimental, and sophisticated. Everything traditional Germany is not. This cultural vibrancy, however, alienates conservatives who see Weimar culture as decadent, un-German, and corrosive of traditional values. Economic prosperity depends on American loans and foreign investment. When the New York Stock Exchange crashes in October 1929, American credit dries up immediately. German banks fail. Businesses collapse. Unemployment soars, reaching 6 million by 1932, nearly one-third of the workforce. The political center disintegrates as desperate voters turn to extremist parties promising radical solutions. The communists gain strength on the left, the National Socialists on the right. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party have been marginal figures during the stable mid-1920s. The Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, an attempt to seize power in Munich, ended in failure and Hitler's imprisonment. During 9 months in Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology of German racial supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and territorial expansion. After release, he rebuilt the Nazi Party as a legal political organization while maintaining the SA, his brown-shirted paramilitary force. But the Nazis won only 2.6% of votes in 1928, seemingly destined for political irrelevance. The Depression changes everything. Nazi vote totals soar: 18% in 1930, 37% in July 1932, making them the Reichstag's largest party. Hitler's message resonates powerfully. Germany has been betrayed by the November criminals who accepted Versailles, by Jews and communists, by weak democratic politicians. He promises national revival, jobs, order, and revenge. His rallies are spectacles of torchlight, martial music, and impassioned oratory. The SA provides muscle, intimidating opponents, and creating an aura of dynamism and power. President Hindenburg, the aged war hero elected in 1925, dislikes Hitler but faces pressure from conservative advisors who believe they can use Nazi popular support while controlling Hitler. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appoints Hitler as chancellor, with conservative politicians holding most cabinet posts. They imagine Hitler as their tool, useful for mobilizing mass support while they exercise real power. This miscalculation will prove catastrophic beyond imagination. The Weimar Republic's cultural explosion represents one of history's great paradoxes. Extraordinary creativity flourishing amid political chaos and economic devastation. While politicians struggled to stabilize democracy and extremists plotted its overthrow, Berlin transformed into Europe's most vibrant, avant-garde cultural capital. The city pulsed with energy, experimentation, and a feverish sense that everything was possible, that the old certainties had dissolved and new forms of art, thought, and life could be created from the ruins of imperial Germany. Weimar cinema achieved worldwide renown, pioneering techniques and themes that would influence filmmaking for generations. Robert Wien's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 established German expressionist cinema's visual language, distorted sets, sharp angles, dramatic shadows, creating psychological landscapes that externalized characters' inner turmoil. The film's twist ending, revealing the narrator as an asylum inmate, reflected post-war Germany's uncertain reality, where traditional authority and rational order had collapsed. Fritz Lang's Metropolis from 1927, the most expensive silent film ever made, depicted a futuristic city divided between wealthy elite and oppressed workers, a parable about industrial capitalism's dehumanizing potential. Its visual splendor and ambiguous politics made it both a masterpiece and a cautionary tale about technology and social division. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu brought vampire mythology to cinema with haunting imagery that influenced horror films forever. His later work, including The Last Laugh and Sunrise, pioneered camera techniques and storytelling methods that liberated cinema from theatrical constraints. Joseph von Sternberg discovered Marlene Dietrich and created The Blue Angel, launching her to international stardom. These directors and many others made German cinema globally influential until the Nazi seizure of power drove most talent into exile, transplanting Weimar's cinematic innovations to Hollywood, where they shaped American film noir and beyond. Theater in Weimar Germany became politically engaged and formally experimental. Bertolt Brecht revolutionized drama through his epic theater, rejecting Aristotelian catharsis in favor of techniques that encouraged critical distance and political consciousness. His collaborations with composer Kurt Weill, particularly the Threepenny Opera from 1928, combined biting social satire with accessible popular music, creating works that entertained while critiquing capitalism and bourgeois morality. Brecht's theories about alienation effects, breaking the fourth wall, and preventing audience identification with characters aimed to transform theater from entertainment into a tool for social change and critical thinking. Max Reinhardt's spectacular productions made Berlin's theaters legendary. Erwin Piscator pioneered documentary theater, incorporating film, statistics, and multimedia elements to address contemporary political issues. These innovations made Weimar theater a laboratory for artistic experimentation, though they also provoked conservative critics who saw such works as decadent attacks on traditional German values. This cultural polarization reflected deeper social divisions, as modernist artists and conservative nationalists fought over Germany's cultural identity. The Bauhaus, founded by Walter Gropius in Weimar in 1919 and later relocated to Dessau, revolutionized design, architecture, and art education. The school's philosophy integrated fine arts, crafts, and industrial design, seeking to create functional beauty appropriate for modern industrial society. Bauhaus teachers, including Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, trained students in a unified approach to design where form followed function, ornament was minimized, and mass production techniques were embraced rather than rejected. The distinctive Bauhaus aesthetic: clean lines, geometric forms, primary colors, innovative materials influenced architecture, furniture design, typography, and product design worldwide. The Bauhaus embodied Weimar modernism's optimistic belief that rational design could improve society, that aesthetics and function could harmonize, and that art should serve ordinary people's needs rather than elite taste. Yet this modernist vision provoked fierce opposition from cultural conservatives who saw Bauhaus designs as sterile, un-German, and destructive of traditional craft and beauty. When the Nazis took power, they closed the Bauhaus, denouncing it as culturally Bolshevist. Many Bauhaus artists and designers emigrated, spreading its influence to America and elsewhere, making its aesthetic globally dominant in post-war architecture and design. Weimar intellectual life flourished with remarkable vitality. The Frankfurt School, including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Walter Benjamin, developed critical theory, combining Marxist analysis with psychoanalysis and cultural criticism to understand modern capitalism's cultural and psychological dimensions. Their work on mass culture, authoritarianism, and alienation remains influential. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time from 1927 revolutionized philosophy with its phenomenological analysis of human existence, though Heidegger's later Nazi affiliations would forever taint his philosophical legacy. German physics reached its zenith during Weimar years. Albert Einstein, already famous for relativity theory, continued working in Berlin. Werner Heisenberg developed quantum mechanics' mathematical foundations and formulated the uncertainty principle. Max Planck, Max Born, and others made Germany the center of the quantum revolution that transformed physics and eventually enabled nuclear energy and modern electronics. German universities maintained their preeminence in physics, chemistry, medicine, and other sciences, attracting students worldwide. This scientific excellence made the Nazi purge of Jewish and politically unacceptable scientists even more catastrophic, depriving Germany of intellectual capital that benefited Britain and America. Weimar's sexual and social liberalism scandalized conservatives but attracted artists, intellectuals, and those seeking freedom from traditional constraints. Berlin's nightlife became legendary for its openness, with cabarets offering risk entertainment, jazz clubs introducing American music, and establishments catering to homosexual clientele operating with relative freedom. Christopher Isherwood's Berlin Stories, later adapted into Cabaret, captured this atmosphere of liberation and decadence, of desperate pleasure-seeking amid economic crisis and looming political catastrophe. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin pioneered sexology and advocated for homosexual rights, performing early gender confirmation surgeries and maintaining a library of materials on human sexuality. This openness represented remarkable progress for the 1920s, though it also made Weimar culture vulnerable to Nazi attacks on degenerate morality. When Hitler took power, the institute was destroyed, its library burned, and Hirschfeld fled into exile. Weimar's sexual liberalism, like its artistic experimentation, proved fragile against totalitarian reaction. Yet focusing solely on Berlin's avant-garde obscures how most Germans experienced Weimar culture. Many provincial Germans view Berlin's modernism with suspicion or hostility, seeing it as un-German, immoral, and symptomatic of national decline. Conservative cultural critics denounced jazz as primitive Negro music, abstract art as charlatan fraud, and sexual liberation as moral degeneracy. This cultural war between cosmopolitan modernism and provincial traditionalism mapped onto political divisions between urban social democrats and rural conservatives, between internationalist liberals and nationalist reactionaries. The Weimar economy's structural weaknesses became catastrophically apparent after 1929. Germany had rebuilt prosperity on foundations of sand, American loans, foreign investment, and international trade. When the New York Stock Exchange crashed in October 1929, American banks recalled loans and stopped new lending. German banks, heavily invested in industry and dependent on foreign credit, faced insolvency. The Danette Bank's collapse in July 1931 triggered banking panic. The government declared a bank holiday, but confidence never fully recovered. Credit dried up, businesses failed, and unemployment soared. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly one-third of the workforce. But statistics barely capture the human suffering. Unemployment meant not just lost income, but lost identity for men whose sense of worth derived from work and providing for families. Middle-class professionals joined manual laborers in unemployment lines. Young people graduated without hope of finding jobs. Families lost savings, homes, and prospects. Soup kitchens fed the hungry. Homeless men slept in parks and under bridges. The psychological impact was devastating, creating despair, resentment, and receptivity to radical political solutions. The government's response, constrained by deflationary economic orthodoxy and reparations obligations, made things worse. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, appointed in 1930, pursued austerity policies, cutting government spending, raising taxes, reducing unemployment benefits. These measures, intended to balance budgets and maintain the gold standard, deepened the depression by reducing aggregate demand. Brüning's nickname, the Hunger Chancellor, reflected popular anger at policies that increased suffering while failing to restore prosperity. Modern economists recognized that Keynesian stimulus spending was needed, but such ideas had not yet gained acceptance, and Germany's fiscal constraints limited options. Political polarization accelerated as economic crisis deepened. The moderate center parties that had governed Weimar Social Democrats, Center Party, German Democrats, German People's Party lost support as voters turned to extremes. The communists gained on the left, advocating revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat. The Nazis surged on the right, promising national revival, jobs, and strong leadership. Street violence between communist Red Front fighters and Nazi SA became routine. Political meetings ended in brawls. Propaganda from both extremes attacked democratic parties as weak, corrupt, and responsible for Germany's suffering. The Nazi rise to electoral dominance was not inevitable, but resulted from specific factors converging. Hitler proved a masterful demagogue, his speeches combining pseudo-religious fervor with concrete promises and scapegoating. The Nazis' propaganda machine, directed by Joseph Goebbels, used modern techniques including radio, film, and sophisticated visual design to spread their message. Nazi rallies became spectacular events, mixing political theater with mass psychology, creating experiences of collective belonging and power that appealed to Germans feeling atomized and powerless. The SA provided muscle and employment. Unemployed men joined the brown shirts, receiving uniforms, meals, and purpose. The SA gave the Nazi movement an aura of dynamism and strength, suggesting that unlike squabbling politicians, the Nazis could take decisive action. The violence the SA inflicted on opponents intimidated some while attracting others who valued strength over legality. Hitler carefully balanced respectability and radicalism, presenting himself as a responsible statesman to conservative elites while unleashing the SA against enemies in the streets. Crucially, conservative elites miscalculated disastrously. Industrialists, landowners, military officers, and conservative politicians feared communism more than fascism. They viewed the Nazis as crude but useful, capable of mobilizing mass support and crushing the left. Franz von Papen, a conservative politician who briefly served as chancellor in 1932, convinced President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in January 1933. With Papen as vice-chancellor and conservatives holding most cabinet positions. Papen famously boasted, "We've hired him," confident that conservatives could control Hitler while using Nazi popularity for their own ends. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong. Within months, Hitler had dismantled the Weimar Constitution, banned opposition parties, and established dictatorship. The conservatives who thought they were using Hitler discovered they had enabled a revolutionary who would sweep away the old order they sought to preserve. The lesson of this miscalculation echoes through history. Authoritarian populists cannot be controlled by establishment figures who lack mass support and mistake demagogues for conventional politicians susceptible to normal political constraints. The question, why did Weimar fail, has preoccupied historians because the answer carries implications for democracy's fragility generally. Multiple factors contributed. The punitive Versailles Treaty that delegitimized the Republic from birth. The lack of democratic tradition in Germany, where most citizens had lived under imperial rule. Economic catastrophes, including hyperinflation and depression that destroyed middle-class security. Political fragmentation that made stable coalition government nearly impossible. A constitution with weaknesses, including Article 48, allowing presidential emergency decrees that undermined parliamentary democracy. And cultural divisions between modernists and traditionalists that prevented shared national identity. Yet Weimar also demonstrated democracy's possibilities. The Republic produced remarkable cultural achievements, improved workers' rights, expanded women's suffrage and opportunities, and created social welfare systems. Many Germans genuinely supported democracy and fought to preserve it. The Republic's failure resulted not from inevitable destiny, but from specific crises and decisions. Different economic policies in 1930–1932, greater willingness by democratic parties to cooperate against extremism, or refusal by conservative elites to enable Hitler might have changed outcomes. History is contingent, not predetermined, though structural factors certainly constrain possibilities. The Weimar Republic's legacy remains ambiguous. It represents both democratic achievement and democratic failure, cultural brilliance and political collapse, progress and catastrophe. Modern Germany has learned from Weimar's mistakes. The Basic Law makes democracy more defensible. Political culture emphasizes consensus and coalition building, and economic policy prioritizes stability. Yet Weimar's warning remains relevant. Democracy requires not just institutions, but democratic culture, economic security, and willingness by elites and citizens to defend it against extremism. The price of Weimar's failure, the Third Reich, World War II, and the Holocaust, demonstrates with terrible clarity what follows when democracy fails and totalitarianism triumphs. Chapter 11. The Third Reich and Final Catastrophe. Hitler moves with stunning speed to consolidate power. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burns. Hitler blames communists and demands emergency powers. Hindenburg issues the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties and allowing arrest without trial. In March elections, Nazis win 44% amidst SA intimidation. Hitler introduces the Enabling Act, granting his government legislative power without parliamentary approval. Combined with terror against opponents, this creates legal dictatorship. Within months, Hitler dismantles German democracy. All political parties, except the Nazis, are banned or dissolved. Trade unions are abolished, replaced by the Nazi-controlled Labor Front. State governments are brought under central control. The SA, threatening to become uncontrollable, is purged in the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when Hitler has SA leader Ernst Röhm and dozens of others murdered, consolidating his control over the party and reassuring the military. When Hindenburg dies in August 1934, Hitler merges the offices of President and Chancellor, becoming Führer, absolute leader, swearing the military to personal loyalty. The Nazi regime transforms Germany into a totalitarian racial state. Jews face escalating persecution, exclusion from professions, loss of citizenship under the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, boycotts of Jewish businesses, and ultimately, after Kristallnacht in November 1938, open violence, deportation, and murder. The regime persecutes other groups too: political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, and the disabled. Concentration camps, initially for political prisoners, become instruments of terror and later extermination. Hitler's foreign policy aims at overturning Versailles and establishing German hegemony over Europe. He violates the treaty systematically. Rearmament begins immediately. Military conscription is reintroduced in 1935. German troops remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936. Each violation meets only weak protests. As Britain and France, traumatized by World War I and divided in their responses, pursue appeasement, hoping to satisfy Hitler's demands and avoid war. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 brings German-speaking Austria into the Reich. Hitler enters Vienna in triumph, annexing his homeland. Next comes the Sudetenland, German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia. At Munich in September 1938, Britain and France agree to German annexation in return for Hitler's promise that this is his last territorial demand. Churchill calls it a choice between war and dishonor, predicting Britain will have both. 6 months later, Hitler seizes the remainder of Czechoslovakia, revealing his promises as worthless. When Hitler demands territorial concessions from Poland and a Nazi Soviet, pact in August 1939, removes threat of Soviet intervention, Britain and France finally draw a line. Hitler invades Poland on September 1, 1939. Britain and France declare war on September 3. World War II begins. The German military achieves stunning victories through blitzkrieg, lightning war combining armor, air power, and mobile infantry. Poland falls in weeks, partition between Germany and the Soviet Union. Denmark and Norway are conquered in April 1940. In May, the Wehrmacht crashes through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, then punches through the Ardennes and encircles Allied armies in Belgium. France, despite possessing comparable forces, collapses in 6 weeks, signing armistice on June 22, 1940. Germany dominates continental Europe from the Atlantic to Poland. Britain fights on alone after France's fall. The Battle of Britain, History's first major air campaign sees the Luftwaffe attempt to gain air superiority for invasion. RAF resistance and German tactical errors force Hitler to postpone invasion indefinitely. Instead, he turns east, planning to crush the Soviet Union and seize living space, Lebensraum, for German colonization. Operation Barbarossa begins on June 22, 1941, hurling 3 million German soldiers into the Soviet Union. Initial victories are spectacular. Vast encirclements trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. German spearheads drive deep into Soviet territory, but the Soviet Union doesn't collapse. Resistance stiffens, distances prove enormous, and winter arrives early. The Wehrmacht reaches Moscow's suburbs but cannot take the city. For the first time, Blitzkrieg fails. The war becomes total. Germany mobilizes its economy completely, using slave labor from occupied territories. Albert Speer, as armaments minister, increases production dramatically despite Allied bombing. But Germany faces an impossible arithmetic. Against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, United States, and British Empire, it cannot win a prolonged war. Hitler's only hope is that the alliance will fracture or that wonder weapons will change the war's trajectory. Neither happens. The Red Army grows stronger, equipped with American trucks and Soviet tanks, learning from defeats. At Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, the bloodiest battle in history destroys an entire German army. Hitler refuses permission to retreat, condemning soldiers to death or capture. The defeat is catastrophic psychologically and militarily. At Kursk in July 1943, the last major German offensive in the east fails disastrously. From then on, the Wehrmacht retreats. In the west, Allied bombers devastate German cities. Hamburg burns in firestorm after 1943 bombing raids, killing 40,000. Dresden's destruction in February 1945 kills tens of thousands. Bombers strike industrial targets, but city centers suffer too, as strategic bombing attempts to break German morale. It doesn't work. Germans fight with desperate determination to the end. The Holocaust proceeds with industrialized efficiency. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 coordinates the final solution: systematic murder of European Jews. Jews are transported from across occupied Europe to death camps in Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. Gas chambers using Zyklon B murder thousands daily. Bodies are burned in crematoria. 6 million Jews perish, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. This genocide represents evil beyond comprehension, industrialized murder on a scale previously unimaginable. D-Day on June 6, 1944, opens the second front Hitler has dreaded. Allied armies land in Normandy, break out, and sweep across France. Paris is liberated in August, Brussels in September. The Red Army drives from the east, liberating Poland, Romania, Hungary. Germany is crushed between advancing armies. Hitler refuses to consider surrender, ordering total resistance, destruction of Germany's infrastructure, and calling for a Wagnerian Dämmerung, twilight of the gods. Some Germans attempt to stop the madness. The July 20, 1944, bomb plot sees army officers attempt to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg plants a bomb at Hitler's headquarters. It explodes, but Hitler survives. The conspiracy collapses, and Hitler takes savage revenge. Over 200 plotters and suspects are executed, many hanged with piano wire. Their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. The war's final months are apocalyptic. The Red Army enters Germany from the east, advancing in a wave of violence and revenge for German atrocities. Millions of German civilians flee westward. Cities become rubble. Germany's very existence as a state dissolves. Hitler retreats to his bunker beneath Berlin, issuing increasingly delusional orders to non-existent armies. while the Red Army fights street by street through Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers close in on the bunker, Adolf Hitler commits suicide, shooting himself after poisoning his new wife. Eva Braun, Admiral Dönitz, named Hitler's successor, attempts to negotiate, but the Allies demand unconditional surrender. On May 7th to 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. The Third Reich, which Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years, has lasted 12. Those 12 years destroyed Germany, killed 60 million people worldwide, devastated Europe, and revealed humanity's capacity for evil on an unimaginable scale. The machinery of the Nazi state operated with terrifying efficiency, even as military defeat became inevitable. Behind the battlefronts in occupied territories stretching from France to Ukraine, the SS administered an empire of exploitation and murder. Heinrich Himmler's organization had evolved from Hitler's personal bodyguard into a state within a state, controlling the police, operating concentration camps, running economic enterprises using slave labor, and fielding its own military divisions. The SS embodied Nazi ideology in its purest, most murderous form, selecting members for racial purity and ideological fanaticism, demanding absolute loyalty to Hitler and the racial mission. The concentration camp system had expanded exponentially during the war. What began as camps for political prisoners in the 1930s had metastasized into a vast network of labor camps, transit camps, and extermination centers. Auschwitz alone had grown into a complex of 3 main camps and dozens of subcamps, serving simultaneously as extermination center, forced labor camp, and industrial site. IG Farben built a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz-Monowitz using slave labor from the camp. Prisoners worked until they literally dropped dead, replaced by fresh transports arriving daily from across occupied Europe. The camp's commandant, Rudolf Hess, would later testify that he supervised the murder of over 2.5 million people during his tenure, though he claimed he was simply following orders, as if mass murder were an administrative task like any other. The psychology of perpetrators continues to fascinate and horrify historians. How did ordinary Germans become mass murderers? Christopher Browning's study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 reveals men who were not fanatical Nazis, not specially selected for cruelty, yet who participated in the shooting of tens of thousands of Jews in Poland. Some initially refused and were allowed to step aside without punishment, yet most participated, eventually becoming habituated to killing. Peer pressure, careerism, ideological indoctrination, and the dehumanization of victims all played roles. The Holocaust was not carried out solely by sadistic monsters, but by bureaucrats, policemen, soldiers, and ordinary citizens who convinced themselves they were serving Germany's interests. The complicity extended throughout German society. While some Germans risked their lives to hide Jews or resist the regime, most either supported Nazi policies or acquiesced through silence. The persecution of Jews had occurred in public, visible to all. Kristallnacht burning synagogues could not be hidden. Jews wore yellow stars identifying them before deportation. While the death camps operated in occupied Poland, far from German cities, their purpose was hardly secret. Soldiers on leave spoke of mass shootings in the East. Workers at armaments plants saw skeletal slave laborers. The smell of burning bodies from nearby camps permeated German towns. Post-war claims that Germans knew nothing of the Holocaust reflect willful ignorance and self-exculpation more than truth. German science and medicine prostituted themselves to Nazi ideology. Joseph Mengele conducted grotesque experiments on twins and other prisoners at Auschwitz, seeking to unlock genetic secrets that might aid the master race. Other doctors tested the limits of human endurance through hypothermia experiments, high-altitude tests, and deliberate infection with diseases. These crimes against humanity, committed by educated professionals who had taken the Hippocratic Oath, represent the complete corruption of scientific ethics by ideology. Some German scientists worked on more conventional weapons research. Werner Heisenberg led the German atomic bomb project, which fortunately never achieved critical mass. Werner von Braun developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, built by slave labor in underground factories where workers died by the thousands from overwork, starvation, and abuse. The V weapons, Hitler's Vergeltungswaffen or vengeance weapons, represented his hope that technology might reverse Germany's military fortunes. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket struck London and other Allied cities from mid-1944 onward, killing thousands of civilians. Hitler obsessed over these weapons, convinced they would terrorize Britain into surrender. Instead, they diverted resources from conventional weapons production while failing to affect the war's outcome. German engineers also worked on jet fighters, the Me-262, which could outfly any Allied aircraft. Introduced too late and in insufficient numbers, these technological marvels made no strategic difference. Hitler's interference in weapons development, insisting the Me-262 be modified as a bomber rather than a fighter, exemplified his disastrous micromanagement of military affairs. As defeat loomed, Nazi ideology became increasingly apocalyptic. Goebbels' propaganda stopped promising victory and instead spoke of heroic resistance, invoking the Spartans at Thermopylae and other doomed last stands. The regime mobilized the Volkssturm, a home guard of old men and boys armed with obsolete weapons or even Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank weapons. These undertrained, poorly equipped forces were supposed to defend Germany against battle-hardened Allied armies. In reality, they died in futile gestures of resistance or fled at the first opportunity. Hitler's Nero Decree of March 1945 ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure to deny it to advancing enemies, a scorched earth policy within Germany itself. Albert Speer, one of the few Nazi leaders to retain some sanity, quietly sabotaged these orders, recognizing that Germany would need these resources to rebuild. The regime's brutality turned increasingly against Germans themselves. Military courts executed soldiers for defeatism, cowardice, or unauthorized retreat. Estimates suggest at least 15,000 German soldiers were executed by their own military for such offenses during the war, far exceeding the number executed by other combatants. SS and military police hanged deserters from lampposts and trees, placing signs around their necks reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the Reich," as warnings to others. This terror became particularly intense in the war's final months, as fanatical Nazis attempted to force continued resistance through intimidation and murder. The treatment of Allied prisoners of war varied by nationality, revealing Nazi racial ideology even in defeat. Western Allied prisoners generally received treatment consistent with Geneva Convention provisions, though conditions deteriorated as Germany's situation worsened. Soviet prisoners faced systematic abuse, starvation, and murder, with mortality rates exceeding 50%. Over 3 million Soviet Poles died in German captivity, victims of deliberate neglect and extermination. This disparity reflected Nazi racial theories that classified Slavs as subhuman, undeserving of humane treatment. The refugee crisis in the war's final months created humanitarian catastrophe. As the Red Army advanced, millions of German civilians fled westward, abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, German territories for centuries, were evacuated under chaotic conditions. Refugees streamed along frozen roads in the dead of winter, harassed by Soviet aircraft and partisans. Perhaps 2 million German civilians died during these expulsions from exposure, starvation, disease, and violence. The Wilhelm Gustloff, a German ship evacuating refugees from East Prussia, was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine on January 30, 1945, killing over 9,000 people, the deadliest maritime disaster in history. This suffering, though dwarfed by Nazi crimes, represented genuine tragedy for individuals who bore no personal responsibility for the regime's atrocities. Inside Germany, cities became landscapes of apocalypse. Strategic bombing by British and American air forces had destroyed urban centers methodically. Hamburg, after Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, was left half-ruined. 40,000 dead from firestorms that created winds of hurricane force and temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Dresden's bombing in February 1945 killed between 25,000 and 40,000, the city's Baroque splendor reduced to rubble. Berlin, pounded by thousands of bombing raids, resembled a shattered wasteland even before the final battle. Germans sheltered in basements and bunkers, emerging to find streets unrecognizable, landmarks obliterated, entire neighborhoods simply gone. The Battle of Berlin from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, served as the Third Reich's death rattle. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers encircled the city, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. German defenders numbered perhaps 300,000, including Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and remnants of Wehrmacht and SS units. The fighting was savage and house to house, each building contested. Soviet artillery fired millions of shells into the city. The Reichstag, symbol of German democracy destroyed by Hitler, became the battle's final objective. Soviet soldiers fought floor by floor through the ruined building, finally raising the red flag over its dome on April 30th. In the Four bunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler spent his final days in a fantasy world, moving non-existent armies on maps, ranting about betrayal, and planning Germany's destruction rather than admit defeat. His physical deterioration was stark. Trembling hands, stooped posture, shuffling gait suggested Parkinson's disease, exacerbated by the methamphetamine injections his doctor provided. He married Eva Braun on April 29th in a surreal ceremony performed while Soviet shells crashed overhead. His political testament blamed Jews for the war and urged Germans to continue racial struggle. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Their bodies burned in the Chancellery Garden as Soviet troops closed in. Hitler's death did not immediately end resistance. Admiral Dönitz, named Hitler's successor, attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies, hoping to continue fighting the Soviets. The Allies refused, demanding unconditional surrender to all Allied powers simultaneously. German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2nd, those in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands on May 4th. The final capitulation, signed at Soviet headquarters in Berlin on May 8th, took effect at midnight, officially ending the war in Europe. May 8th became VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, celebrated with wild jubilation in Allied capitals while Germans contemplated the ruins of their nation. The human cost of World War II in Europe defies comprehension. Over 60 million people died, including at least 27 million Soviet citizens, 6 million Poles, 6 million Jews, and between 5 and 7 million Germans. Entire cities lay in ruins. Borders were redrawn. Millions of refugees wandered across the continent. Europe's prominent position in world affairs had ended, replaced by American and Soviet dominance. The old European order, with its empires and balance of power politics, was finished, destroyed by the war that Germany initiated. The discovery of concentration camps shocked even hardened soldiers. American troops liberating Buchenwald, Dachau, and other camps found mountains of corpses, walking skeletons barely alive, and evidence of industrial-scale murder. Eisenhower ordered German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps and bury the dead, forcing them to confront what had been done in their name. Newsreels showed these horrors to stunned audiences worldwide. The Holocaust's full scale emerged gradually as camps across Poland were liberated, and survivors testified. The enormity of Nazi crimes against humanity became undeniable, documented in meticulous Nazi records and confirmed by countless witnesses. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, attempted to bring Nazi leaders to justice. 24 major war criminals faced charges including crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This last, a new legal concept developed specifically to address the Holocaust. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others sat in the dock, defended by lawyers confronted with evidence of their crimes. Some, like Göring, remained defiant. Others claimed they were following orders or ignorant of atrocities. The trials established important precedents. Superior orders are no defense for crimes against humanity. Aggressive war is itself criminal, and individuals can be held accountable under international law. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, others to long imprisonment. Göring committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution, cheating the hangman. Subsequent trials prosecuted lower-level officials, doctors who conducted experiments, judges who perverted justice, and industrialists who exploited slave labor. The Einsatzgruppen trial prosecuted commanders of mobile killing squads that murdered over 1 million Jews in the Soviet Union. The justice case tried judges and prosecutors who implemented Nazi racial laws. These trials documented systematically how Nazi criminality permeated German institutions, from the military to medicine, from industry to the judiciary. Germany itself ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The Allies divided it into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was similarly divided. The Potsdam Conference in summer 1945 confirmed these arrangements and established principles for Germany's future: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. Germany would be treated as a single economic unit, but political development soon shattered this unity. The Cold War's onset drove the Western and Soviet zones apart. In 1949, the Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany, a democratic state aligned with the West, while the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, a communist dictatorship. Germany would remain divided for 4 decades, a physical manifestation of the Cold War's division of Europe. The German people faced a process of collective reckoning called Vergangenheitsprotest, coming to terms with the past. This process involved multiple stages: initial denial and self-pity, gradual acknowledgement of Nazi crimes, and ultimately acceptance of historical responsibility. The 1960s saw renewed interest among younger Germans in confronting their parents' generation about the Nazi era. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt from 1963 to 1965 brought Holocaust perpetrators to justice and educated Germans about crimes committed in their name. The 1979 television miniseries Holocaust reached millions of Germans, making the genocide's reality visceral and personal. Modern Germany has made historical memory central to national identity in unprecedented ways. Holocaust memorials dot the landscape, from the vast memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in central Berlin to smaller stumbling stones, Stolperstein, embedded in sidewalks before the last homes of Holocaust victims. School curricula extensively covered the Nazi period, and German politicians regularly acknowledge historical guilt. This memorialization represents a unique national reckoning, an acceptance of historical responsibility without parallel among nations that have committed atrocities. Yet questions remain about memory's completeness. East Germany's communist regime portrayed itself as anti-fascist, claiming to have broken cleanly with the Nazi past, while many former Nazis found positions in West German institutions. The extent of ordinary Germans' complicity continues to provoke debate. How much did they know? How much could they have done? The answers matter not just for historical understanding, but for contemporary questions about individual responsibility in authoritarian systems. about nationalism's dangers, and about how societies can prevent atrocity. The Third Reich shadow extends beyond Germany. The Holocaust fundamentally changed how humanity understands evil, genocide, and human rights. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 responded directly to Nazi atrocities. The Genocide Convention, also from 1948, made genocide an international crime. International humanitarian law developed significantly in response to World War II's horrors. The principle that individuals bear personal responsibility for crimes against humanity, regardless of official position or state orders, became established in international law. The Nazi experience also revealed modernity's dark potential. The Holocaust was not a pre-modern pogrom but industrialized, bureaucratic murder employing modern technology, organization, and scientific rationality toward evil ends. This disturbing truth challenges Enlightenment faith in progress and reason. The same modernity that brings prosperity and freedom can, under certain conditions, produce unprecedented evil. Understanding how this happened, how an advanced Western nation embraced totalitarian ideology and committed genocide, remains essential for preventing future atrocities. As you contemplate this darkest chapter of German and human history, remember that it was not inevitable, not the product of some unique German character flaw, but the result of specific historical circumstances, ideological choices, and individual decisions. Good people failed to resist, ordinary people committed atrocities, and civilized institutions proved fragile when confronted with totalitarian determination. These lessons remain relevant as we face our own challenges, reminding us that democracy, human rights, and human decency require constant vigilance and active defense. The Third Reich fell, but its warnings echo through time, urging us toward the better angels of our nature and alerting us to the ever-present dangers of hatred, nationalism, and totalitarian ideology. Conclusion: the long shadow of empire. And so ends the story of the German empires, a saga spanning more than a millennium. From Charlemagne's coronation in 800 to Hitler's bunker in 1945. 3 Reichs rose and fell. The Holy Roman Empire, enduring over 1,000 years, but politically fragmented and ultimately medieval in character. The German Empire of 1871 to 1918, forged by Prussian power and destroyed by imperial overreach. And the Third Reich, a 12-year nightmare of totalitarian horror that brought about Germany's near-total destruction. What lessons emerge from this epic history? The Holy Roman Empire demonstrates that political institutions can endure for centuries through sheer inertia and symbolic power, even when they lack effective authority. Its federalism, though frustrating to those seeking German unity in the 19th century, perhaps prevented the worst horrors of absolute centralized power. The empire's religious diversity, forced by the Reformation and codified at Westphalia, taught religious toleration through exhaustion rather than principle, but the lesson endured. The Second Reich shows both the achievements and perils of unification through military power. Bismarck's genius created a German nation-state that became Europe's leading economy and a major cultural center. But the Reich's militaristic foundation, its semi-authoritarian constitution, and its aggressive foreign policy ultimately led to catastrophic war. The tragedy of 1914 stemmed partly from structural problems built into Bismarckian Germany, a powerful military uncontrolled by civilian politics, an insecure nationalism seeking recognition through power, and a constitution that granted democratic forms without democratic substance. The Weimar Republic's failure demonstrates democracy's fragility in adverse conditions. Economic crisis, political extremism, cultural divisions, and an unjust peace settlement overwhelmed Germany's first democracy. Yet Weimar's failure was not inevitable. Different decisions at key moments. Had Ebert reformed the army and judiciary in 1919, had conservative politicians refused to enable Hitler in 1933 might have changed history's course. The lesson is sobering. Democracy requires not just institutions, but political culture, economic stability, and leaders committed to democratic values, even when inconvenient. The Third Reich remains the darkest chapter in German and human history. How a civilized nation, the land of Goethe and Beethoven, of philosophy and science, could embrace such evil continues to challenge understanding. The Holocaust particularly defies comprehension. Systematic, bureaucratic genocide carried out by ordinary people who convinced themselves they served a higher purpose. The Third Reich's legacy is an eternal warning about totalitarianism, racial ideology, and the dangers of mass politics manipulated by demagogues. Modern Germany has emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich as a democratic, peaceful power. The Federal Republic, founded in 1949 in West Germany and extended to unified Germany in 1990, learned from history's harsh lessons. Its constitution protects human rights absolutely. Its federalism prevents centralized tyranny, and its political culture emphasizes consensus and moderation. Germany has become Europe's economic anchor and a major supporter of European integration, channeling nationalist energies into constructive cooperation. Yet the shadows of empire still linger. German reunification in 1990 raised old fears of German domination, though largely unfounded. Germany's economic strength in the European Union creates asymmetries and resentments. The memory of Nazi crimes remains central to German identity, shaping how Germans see themselves and are seen by others. No German politician can invoke patriotic symbols without awareness of their historical burden. The story of the German empires is ultimately a human story about ambition and tragedy, achievement and horror, the heights and depths of which humanity is capable. It reminds us that history is not predetermined, that human choices matter, and that civilization remains always fragile, requiring constant vigilance to preserve. As you drift off to sleep, carry with you not just the facts and dates, but the deeper truths about power, ideology, nationalism, and moral responsibility that this long history teaches. The German empires rose and fell, but their lessons endure, warning and guiding us as we navigate our own uncertain times. Rest well, knowing that understanding history, however dark, is the first step toward ensuring its worst chapters are never repeated.